Welcome to the NACD Northern California program, the next era of board evaluations from compliance to strategic advantage. I am thrilled to have four speakers with me today. Jessica Denoncourt, an independent director for Pacific Gas and Electric. Brian Wong, Vice President and General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Pacific Gas and Electric. Louis Lehot, partner at Foley and Lardner, and Logan McDougall, a consultant and Bay Area offices leader for Aegon Zender. And I'm Lori Yoler. I am a partner at deep tech venture capital firm Playground Global and a board member for Church and Dwight and NACD Northern California and an advisory board member for Aptiv. Today, we are going to talk about the evolution from traditional board evaluations, which were checklist items, to more forward-looking evaluations that take into account the many changes in governance, in technology, and in culture. So, let me set the scene. Board evaluations in the past have really been kind of a perfunctory exercise and by their very nature, backward looking. However, increasingly, evaluations are being viewed as a critical strategic forward indicator to see things like, does the board have the right judgment, speed, and composition to navigate what's next? Especially when new risks, technology, and competition for talent are evolving faster than any director can individually keep up. So this topic today is going to be covered by our four esteemed speakers, and I'm going to start by having them each introduce themselves briefly before we jump into questions. So please go ahead and start. Logan, you're the one next to me on my screen, so why don't you go ahead and start?
The hot seat, the virtual hot seat. So thanks to NACD for hosting this. Logan McDougall, I work for a company called Aegon Zender, which many of you may not have heard of before. We're one of the oldest and the largest privately held search firms in the world. We've got about 40 offices, 2,600 consultants doing work across recruitment, but also a lot of work with board effectiveness and advisory kind of services. So we've been around since the 60s, and we've been working with boards since that period of time. I have not been working since the 60s on that topic, but I work across consumer products and tech, but also lead the San Francisco and Palo Alto offices. So, pleased to bring that kind of independent advisor voice to what should be a great conversation.
Thanks so much. Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica Denoncourt, and I am on the board of Pacific Gas and Electric. I've been on the board for 5 years. I do chair the Governance and Sustainability Committee. I'm also part of the People and Comp Committee and the Safety and Nuclear Operation Committee. Prior to joining PG&E, I was the Chief Information Officer and Data Privacy Officer for Varian Medical Systems. And I actually partner very closely with Brian Wong, who is also on this panel today. So we're excited to be able to share a perspective from PG&E.
So Brian, please introduce yourself. Thanks, Jessica.
Sure. Great to see everyone. I'm Brian Wong. I'm Corporate Secretary and, as mentioned, General Counsel of Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which is the utility subsidiary of PG&E Corporation, our parent company, which is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Our utility is the largest energy utility in California, serving Central and Northern California. Before PG&E, I led the corporate and securities practice at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman in San Francisco.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Louis?
Good afternoon, everybody. Louis Lowe here from Foley and Lardner, sitting on top of University Avenue in downtown Palo Alto, and glad to be with you. I'm going to bring the perspective of the non-director, the guy who sits and scribes notes from 500 hours of board meetings every year, thereabouts, Lori, and thanks for putting this panel together. I think it's going to be fun.
And as we've learned, you have to be really careful about how you write those notes. So Louis, as the lawyer, you sit in on hundreds of hours of board meetings, including the board evaluation process. What are some of the red flags you've seen during evaluations, and what are some things that we should be cognizant of?
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Let me zoom out just for a second. I think that the approach to board evaluations really has had three lives, and I would say uh, version 1.0 happened in 2002 after Sarbanes-Oxley, and as a young lawyer, I would put together a checklist based on looking at the Council of Institutional Investors and others, and I'd have a 30-page list of 100 questions, and I would circulate it. I'd get no answers. And then some smart person would say, hey, Louis, why don't you check all the boxes that have the best answers and then circulate a summary to the board of everyone's answers that you already answered. So that was version 1.0. And the red flag there was there really was no process. It was really a check the box form over substance compliance exercise. And I would say somewhere in the late 2000s, maybe it was before, maybe it was during the great financial crisis, I saw some forward-thinking boards use the process in what I'll call version 2.0 to solve problems. But they already knew what the problem was, Lori, and that was to really help put a box around a director who was maybe not being as productive as that director could be, maybe not being as prepared, not showing up. So it was, let's go solve this problem through the evaluation process. And then I would say somewhere during COVID, I saw the emergence of what I'll call 3.0. And 3.0 was a very thoughtful process where outside counsel would come in, do some interviews with individual directors and then report back orally. And the advantage there was preserving attorney-client privilege by having an outside counsel do it, getting more candor by having this done through the outside counsel rather than somebody inside the company. And also exploring what issues were. And then I would say version 4.0, which is what I hope we're going to get to today, is really a 360 process where management is involved, committees are involved, and the board is involved in both formulating the process, the questions, the goals, and really looking forward, not just looking backward. But that wasn't your question, Lori. The question were, what are the red flags? And I would say some red flags I've seen is not following through on the findings. Again, more of this check the box process. Individual directors not responding. Tokenism, politics, I see some of that. And just a lack of connection to the strategic priorities of where the company is really going. But I've talked too much, Lori. But hopefully that set the table for our discussion.
Terrific. Thanks. I think you talked about in your stage two solving problems and that problem director, but it's sometimes difficult to know if everyone on the board thinks there is a problem director and how big is the problem? Is it just someone who's constantly reading their email during the board meeting? Or is it something more serious and someone who's being divisive? So I'm sure we will explore all of this. Logan, as a firm, Egon Zehnder has a board evaluation service. What do you believe a third party like Egon Zehnder can add to that process?
So I'm coming from a different perspective on this than someone like Louis or Jessica and Brian in terms of, they're going to be much more focused on kind of the legal risk, the compliance components, the regulatory components. We tend to work mostly with companies on board effectiveness, so government effectiveness. So we've been leaning into these kinds of questions about who talks when, how effectively is the board addressing the top issues, where are you going with the board for many, many years, and working with both public companies, private equity-backed companies, a range of sizes and scales. So I think coming to the question of a third party, there is something about having a neutral, objective perspective on how companies are doing. And we've been, for example, leveraging AI or leveraging new technologies to think about the board as a holistic unit and what are they doing, what are they talking about, what are they deciding upon, and providing that perspective back to the companies. We have the luxury of we're not as restricted in some of the work that we do as someone like Louis, where you've got to, deal with the gnarly elements of client privilege, et cetera. We tend to be focused more on kind of the advisory component of, is a board working effectively, and if not, why?
Thanks so much. And, in my experience, I've seen a very rigorous process for my public company boards and my very large private company boards, but haven't really seen that as much for smaller private companies, venture-backed companies. Are you seeing a change there? Or because you mentioned you've done evaluations or helped with board effectiveness on all sizes of companies. What do you have
Correct.
any stats or thoughts on the size of company when that board evaluation process actually takes place?
I think that's where we're starting to really see the technology leverage coming in. So some of the tools, for example, leveraging AI to assess, meeting effectiveness, et cetera, is something that doesn't have to only apply to a scaled company. Whereas 25 years ago, we would be mainly working for very big public companies or private companies where, they would have the kind of structure and processes to support an independent third party. With technology, it's one of actually the very exciting parts is that we can do that quickly, efficiently, and easily for smaller companies as opposed to only servicing the big ones. So I think that's probably the biggest element is the democratization of some of these board effectiveness assessments looking forward because of what we're bringing differently than we were when it was more bespoke and top company only.
Thanks so much. Jessica and Brian, you work together closely on board evaluations for PG&E. What are your roles and responsibilities in this process, and what are your best practices? What have you learned, and how has your process evolved over the years?
That's a lot of topics. I'll start off, and Jessica can add as we go. And I also see our utility chair on the call, so Cheryl, feel free to comment as well. Um, we have sort of an alternating process. I will say from a cadence perspective, in general, about every 3 years, we have an outside consultant of some sort come in to help us with the evaluation process. And in the years in between, we do it as an internal process, sort of. And the process itself is two parts. One is an online survey that we use, an internal survey we try to keep the questions relatively consistent from year to year so that we can see trends emerging. That being said, every year, Jessica and the Sustainability and Governance Committee look at the questions and give comments and feedback from both of them and any outside consultants we're using on the quality of the questions. So we have that. We also have individual interviews with board members. And so either Jessica will sit down with our board members or we'll ask the outside consultant to do that. That both of those feed into feedback in a board meeting to both the committees and the board from the Sustainability and Governance Committee. And if we're using an outside consultant, then the outside consultant will feed some of the feedback to the board as a whole as well. Jessica, I think one of the important things that Jessica innovated is that we actually come up with action items that we share back for either the Sustainability and Governance Committee, the board as a whole, or other committees, and we follow up throughout the year. It's really, I think, evolved into a year-round integrated process with some of the other things that as a corporate secretary group we do to support the Sustainability and Governance Committee.
The one thing, Brian, I'd add to that is that
Yeah.
when we have this last time we used our outside partner, they did also interviewed the management team. And so we wanted their feedback on the board effectiveness and the relationship. So it wasn't only just the board directors, it was the executive team, so that we could learn from them how we could be more effective. So that was something that evolved over time. The other thing I'd say is that we have a partnership, Brian and I, and his team, in terms of the whole process and making sure that it's integral in our work plan for the year. The tone is set at the top, meaning everybody's going to get feedback. Everybody needs to give feedback. And I'd say at the beginning, we had directors that didn't give feedback and they got a call and they needed to give feedback, or they didn't set the interview up. They needed to do that. So it wasn't acceptable not to be part of the process. So setting that tone was important. We talked about, I'd say best practice is using an outside party, because I think it gives a safe place to talk about things, but also to do that 360, more interview style type of questions, and also getting feedback on the questions we're doing. The other thing I'd say is I do meet every year with every director and talk about their desires, what committees they want to be on, what chair they might want to be, what kind of education they might want, what are their plans for retiring, or do they have plans for other jobs that might impact what they do for PG&E, and so that we have a succession plan. So we really have evolved it so that it ties to the succession planning for the board itself. And then I think the last thing was just building a culture on the board that it's okay to talk about this stuff, whether there's issues, problems, what different skill sets we might need. So we actually do also review the skill set matrix every year and tie that into the evaluation process. So ask our board directors what might be missing, what skill sets are missing, and it's not an issue that we're missing something, it's what we might need in the future because the strategy of the company might be different. So really having an open discussion about all these things at the Sustainability and Governance Committee, but also, with the whole entire board. So those would be how it's evolved over the 5 years. And I actually think we have a culture that really is very willing to give feedback.
I hope everybody in the crowd is listening here, because this is really best in class what I'm hearing. And I'm not saying that nicely. To set the legal standard, the New York Stock Exchange requires, as a condition to maintaining listing, that these evaluations be conducted on an annual basis and disclosure made. NASDAQ does not have that rule, although I think most NASDAQ companies do this process. I think what I've heard is really best in class, and really what I call board evaluations 4.0, and that's why Jessica and Brian are here today. One of your questions, Lori, though, was when is the right time for boards to start this process? And we start talking about all of these governance requirements sometime in the 12 to 24 months before a company goes public, that that this will be required. And I think it can be a tool to talk about up-leveling the board as part of the pre-IPO planning. Lori. I wish more boards, though, did this exercise, and it's challenging to get people to focus on it, especially in the private context where all the focus is on revenue growth and profitability and seeing those 8 quarters out.
Absolutely. And Jessica, you mentioned including the leadership team. In my experience, certain members of the leadership team interact, for example, the financial professionals, more with the audit committee, but may not have as much exposure to the full board. How do you handle which leadership team members to include and how much exposure they might have to board members in that evaluation process?
The CEO's executive leadership team all participates, and they're actually in the board meetings. They don't just attend the one committee meeting that they're part of. So they are very much engaged, and we are partnered as chairs of each of the committees with an executive of the company. So they have a really good perspective on that relationship, particularly with a committee, but also in general with the board. It's very inclusive of the CEO's executive team.
Thanks so
One
much.
thing I probably
Okay.
need to involve Brian's team a little more, because they work with everybody, but the legal counsel is part of it, but maybe one dive deeper might be an improvement.
Yeah, no, it's hard to sometimes figure out, in my experience, which leadership team members to include in that evaluation process and which ones are really going to have insight and will have seen multiple boards perhaps to know what is good and what is not good and what's expected. So I think that's interesting. So Logan, where do boards most often overestimate their effectiveness and what tends to be overlooked?
So I'd start by agreeing with both Jessica and Louis' points. I mean, boards are evolving really, really quickly, and the requirements and the expectations on boards are evolving quickly, as well as you're seeing a separation of kind of best in class, 4.0 or whatever words we want to use to describe those that are leaning in versus those that are kind of resistant. At the end of the day, the goal of the board, from my perspective, is to have the right conversations at the right time. And so the question is, are boards sometimes substituting process and, oh, I have a regular committee meeting and I'm meeting X times a year and I'm talking through topics X, Y, Z for having those powerful conversations at the right time? And so are they flexing how they're meeting, what they're talking about, how they're bringing in the teams in various places in the right way to make sure that the board is providing kind of timely, focused, strong advice on what's needed right then? Or is the company leaning on, oh, we have a structured set of discussions and interventions that if we follow, we will successfully accomplish what we're looking for. So to me, it's the holistic component around. I think they often, kind of conflate. I've had a meeting to I provided value as a board to the senior leadership team, and being really objective and clear about, has the board actually been included? Are they providing perspectives where needed and when needed, or are they being used as a bit of a crutch to justify decisions that the executive team has already made? So I think there's no one factor. It's the question of, is a board a strong voice, or is it, only being used in certain ways at certain times?
And when you have looked at that evaluation process, when I first started going through them, there was like a number scale of 1 to 5, and which I found not useful at all because what I might consider a 3, someone else might consider a 5, and someone else might consider a 1. And so, how do you think about getting everyone on the same page in terms of what great looks like or where you are in the spectrum? Any thoughts on that?
I think the heart of that is, I mean, is there a structured assessment? So do you have a number of different ways? Would we do formal assessments of boards? We'll have up to 12 or 13 criteria that we're looking at in terms of, what are we talking about? What's going on? Everything from, is the board composed the right way? What types of conversations are being had? What are the committees covering, et cetera? But the combination of those discussions, plus this element of, are you talking about it? So rather than just getting a board report, which is a series of numbers and data, is the board actually sitting down and talking about, for you, what does a 3 mean versus to someone else, what does a 3 or a 5 mean? It's not the numbers per se, it's the question of the shape of the responses and then the discussion around the same, right? So to me, are you doing it as a good hygiene effort where you're just making sure that you're ticking it, or are you actually leveraging it for a powerful conversation? And I think that's where, kind of the best in class boards are using it as a means to kind of have the conversations, and fundamentally, are they preparing for, talking for, addressing things clearly, openly, confidently, all those sorts of areas? And is the board aligned about what the top priorities should be for
I
discussion?
think that's right. It's the combination, Jessica, between both the online survey and the conversations that Jessica or the consultant or the committee as a whole has with each other. And that's where you get alignment on what the numbers mean.
And Brian, PG&E is a highly regulated in a highly regulated industry.
We are.
You mentioned the skills matrix before, and obviously Logan was talking about what are the skills required on the board right now and in the
Yeah.
future. How do you use your skills matrix in a practical sense? And how does your evaluation process work to identify the skills the board needs in the future and what good needs to be? And how do you think about having those conversations? Because, for example, if you say everyone needs to be a tech expert in the future and you look at your board and no one has tech experience, how do you think about that? How do you convey that to your board? And
Right.
obviously, you and Jessica have to talk about that. How do you think about all that?
Well, we do. Our skills matrix is unique in the sense that we agreed to it with the state. So we've agreed with the CPUC certain skills, not all of them, that will be represented on the board. And so we end up with a relatively large board that way. But it does help with assigning people to committees. The committees, bespeak particular kinds of skills and expertise and require them. So we think about that when we're thinking how people get assigned to committees, and of course that means you need to think about succession planning when you're doing that, right? And so the skills feed into succession planning. And when I think a little bit about the prior conversation, we think about not only the skills that people bring, like Jessica brings technical and technological skills and AI skills and cyber skills to this board. So when management is thinking about who can I go to on the board to just talk through an issue, they think about Jessica for particular things, for sustainability, for technology, for cyber. And so they'll go to them offline and have conversations. So that I think, Logan, is about like this is not check the box, right? This is a mentorship relationship. Our management thinks about our board as a set of mentors for them as well. So I think that's part of it is the skills help us see that the entire board is functioning together. We could have just used it as a compliance check the box because we're required to do it and we're required to disclose it. It's really helpful, I will add, for our shareholders in our proxy when we publish the skills matrix to know what we're looking at. So oftentimes they'll sort of poke at it and they'll say, "Oh, look at page 53 of the proxy," and they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's there. Thank you." Um, and we have to not make sure it's not check the box, right? So Jessica asks every year, are there skills that are missing? Are there trends coming that we need to prepare for? Because of course it's hard to find people with, particular skills. And so it feeds into the board refreshment, the recruiting, and the succession planning.
Yeah,
And this question came in the box. Do you all have age limits or term limits for your folks to help with refreshment?
we actually have a average tenure for the whole board of 10 years, and then a age limit of 75. And we publish that, and it does help with refreshment in the sense that you have to plan that you might have people leaving. And for example, during the bankruptcy in 2020, when we almost put everybody new on the board, we have an issue in 2030. We actually have a matrix, a chart, so that we know when we have to do refreshment. We have to think maybe ahead of schedule in terms of that year 2030, because we know we're going to have an issue. And it's very open discussion. So again, all the board directors know that we're going to talk about succession planning, refreshment, that, we do work to the guidelines that we have in our chart guidelines.
And maybe just building on Jessica's point, I think term limits, are clearly a best in class to make sure that you have a freshness of thought. You don't have, 30-year board directors, kind of within companies. There's been a bit of a shift on the age limits to talking about effectiveness and impact as opposed to, calendar year elements, So I think that's been a pivot in the last few years, whereas, 5, 10 years ago, it was all about, 65, 75, some age limit. I think folks have gotten wise to the fact that, age is just a number in terms of you can have some very highly contributing board members at various ages, but you have to be checking to make sure that they're contributing.
Yeah, it does seem age, it's really how healthy and sharp are you rather than a number. So that makes good sense. Jessica, continuing on your experience, are you using technology or data analytics in your evaluations, or are your evaluations mostly qualitative? And what kinds of questions do you find are most effective for really understanding what's going on?
Well, it's interesting because when I started, I'm very analytical. So I wanted yes, no, Likert scale. And I really pushed that at the beginning. But what I found was that's great to show trends. But we really need to have sometimes when the trends, hit something, we need to have a conversation. So having open-ended questions as well is really important. So we do use the analytics to show the trends year over year, also the areas where we might want more discussion. But I find that the qualitative um, questions are actually somewhat better, particularly when we have an outside party doing it. So I like those as well. So it's a combination, I believe. We do this in Board Vantage, so we have a platform that we are using to do the surveys. Uh, and I have a favorite question, and so I'll read it. When you consider the overall background, skills, diversity, and experience of each board, what areas stand out as strengths? What areas stand out as areas for improvement? And what's missing? And that's the one I get the most feedback on, from board directors about what they feel, maybe they're missing, what they feel the board needs moving forward. And that again is used for part of our, plans for the future. Again, I think it's a combination. I know people have asked about AI and do we use any of that to do anything? At this point, no. We'd love to use AI. I would, to use it more for a secure environment um, within our documents to help us, but be more productive, but nothing where we'd go out and share it and it's public and all of that. But again, um, a combination of qualitative and quantitative.
Okay, Louis, we've been quiet for a while, so I'm going to switch to you for a moment. Um, we've mentioned attorney-client privilege for that is sometimes required or may be required for public companies. Can you tell us more about how and when this comes into play during the evaluation process? What advantage does it offer? Does involving counsel early materially change what directors are willing to say? And or how these findings can perhaps be documented and acted upon? Are there circumstances when privilege really needs to be intentionally preserved, and others where transparency might be more valuable than legal protection?
Lori, you have mastered the compound question. So let me try and take that in pieces. So just to kind of set the stage, attorney-client privilege is a doctrine that protects the sanctity of a communication between an attorney and her or his client. It means that that conversation, if protected, would not be disclosed in any kind of litigation or discovery process, and would ideally drive transparency. So the idea is that if a director felt that her or his statements were going to be privately kept between that director and the interviewer and anonymously attributed, you would think that there would be more transparency and candor. So that's the goal. And that's why, this may sound self-interested, I think that attorneys are best, and outside counsel are really well positioned to execute on this task. I think internal counsel like Brian are also well positioned to take on the task, but since they report to everyone involved, whether it's the CEO, the CFO, the audit committee, the board itself, they're often put in an awkward position if they learn something about another executive or director. And so if I was a general counsel, I would not want to be on the tip of the spear doing that evaluation. Now, as most of you know, an attorney-client privilege will not be respected if the subject matter is not legal advice. or if the contents of the communication are shared with people that are not the client. And so some people think that if you just copy your lawyer on an email that it's privileged. Well, no, it isn't. If it's to a third party, and some people think that anything they talk about with their lawyer is privileged. Well, no, it isn't. Somebody's if it doesn't tie back to a legal matter, then it may not be protected. And so we try and derive a process from the outset that would protect the privilege, would encourage transparency, and ultimately drive impact. Is what our common goal is to increase the effectiveness of the board and each of the committees so that the company can achieve its goals.
And so I know what I had heard from folks talking about this matter is if you're in the middle of litigation, you absolutely should ensure that you have a lawyer doing the evaluation because you may need to be talking about things that went down under attorney-client privilege. But when should you be really sensitive to perhaps wanting attorney-client privilege in the evaluation process, and when do you think you could use a non-attorney who also might get more candor? How do you think about that? And when can those documents actually be subject to litigation or brought into litigation?
Great questions, and I think I failed to answer some of those in your first articulation. So let me try again. I think one should always be sensitive to privilege, no matter the circumstances that you're in, whether you're in the middle of a public-public merger or a litigation or a sensitive internal investigation or anything, because I think that you may stumble upon something in this exercise, and in fact, it's designed for you to discover what these things are. And so I think always you should be sensitive to the privilege. When I do these things, I typically create handwritten notes that I don't make digital on purpose. And I don't ever create a written report, because even if I render it in a privileged fashion, it's likely to be shared despite all of my entreaties not to. It's likely to get to somebody, and then so I don't expect that the privilege is necessarily maintained. And to your point, those are the circumstances where I would be extra careful not to create unnecessary writings and try and have a discussion that maintains the privilege and is more effective at driving whatever is the learning and the change. Hopefully that did a
That
better job.
absolutely, and thanks. The handwritten notes, I had not heard that before from the outside attorney, so that's very interesting. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. Evaluations are only as valuable as the board's willingness to act on what they reveal. You know, one of the big mistakes I've heard is, okay, you go through this whole evaluation process with an outsider, and then you don't take into account any of their recommendations. So with that in mind, let's explore some real problems that directors encounter during evaluations and hear your best practices. So I'm going to give you some scenarios. The first scenario is you run an evaluation process and it surfaces a consistent pattern. One long-standing committee chair is disengaged, chronically late on deliverables, and not providing meaningful leadership. And this is a chair, so we really care. Yet this director is well-liked, influential, and very resistant to shifting roles. And I have also seen chairs often don't like to be unchaired, dethroned. So, Brian, whose responsibility is to bring this up in the discussion, and how do you go about it, and where do those previous evaluations come into play?
When I thought about this question, first of all, I think it really just comes down to having the right board culture, right? Setting the tone at the top, whether that's through the chair or through the sustainability and governance chair. But it does come down to board culture. And when I think about why it works for us, it is really that if you think about the mindset, it's about growth mindset. And are we developing our directors as well? Are we thinking of our directors as an opportunity to develop them? And so when you have conversations about here are the skills, here's this, where would you like to, when Jessica asked, where else would you like to go? Who have you set up as your successor for this chair? Let's talk about how we get them in place for succession. That helps you engage with them on some of the behaviors that are impeding that growth and succession, both for them and for other members of the board. And I think you have to think about it as the board as a whole needs to grow as well. That's kind of the main thing. And the evaluation process, especially the one-on-one conversations, is where that needs to happen. And that can from the corporate secretary's point, that's coaching coaching your chairs on having the right conversations. Corporate secretaries often find that they're kind of propping people up, right? And so you have an open relationship with your governance chair, then you can have those conversations of, I'm seeing this, let's see if it comes out in the evaluation process.
And who is the right person to have that discussion with the board member in question?
I'm a big fan of it has to come from all directions, right? We have to be on the same page and it has to come from all directions. So it's coming from the chair of the board. It's coming from the it's coming from the Sustainability and Governance Committee in our case, and that's through the chair. It's coming from the corporate secretary and it's coming from our CEO. And as Miss Jessica mentions, we have buddies for each of the chairs of our committees, and so there's a member of the executive team who's buddied up with each chair.
But you think the member of the executive team could go to the chair on the board and say, hey, you're not holding up your effectiveness?
I think I think our CEO is a strong CEO, and she can have those kinds of conversations.
Wow, terrific. Okay, thank you.
And Jessica looks like she's about to say
Yeah.
No,
something.
the only other thing I'd say is I do think, that the chair of the governance committee is accountable to give feedback, but also working with the chair of the board. I mean, I wouldn't give that feedback without being aligned with the chair of the board. So, when I've not at this company, but at a previous one where we had situation like this, I was head of the governance committee and I went to the chair of the board and said, we need to talk to this person so that we're both aligned. I wouldn't do it on my own. I
Right,
would make sure I was aligned with the chair of the board,
right.
even though I was chair of the Sustainability and Governance Committee.
And Lori, I think old school, right? You would have to rely on your age limit and tenure,
Yep,
right? And so that's why
absolutely.
it's so important to build a good board culture.
Exactly. And I'm looking in the chat. Christian Garcia said, according to a recent PwC study, 55% of board directors and 93% of management feel at least one board member should be replaced, both at record highs. This study, coupled with the decline in board turnover in 2025, suggests that either the evaluations have not been effective or at least they're not being actioned. And so I think it really requires courage and a strong chair slash lead director slash CEO to make that change because I've seen these numbers for a while, but that is getting higher. And so the question is, why is there not more action?
Well, and I also think it helps that when you have just a 1 year voting, voting meaning they're re-upped every year, that you actually can have those discussions a little bit easier in the sense that, hey, if that skill set's not needed anymore, they might not be put forward for the next reelection. And it's on
True.
a yearly basis. So I think that helps as well.
We have
Je-
renomination standards.
Mhm.
Jessica and Brian are describing what I would call utopia, which is this perfect world that I don't live in for the most part, and most of my clients, don't even have a board chair, whether they're private or public. We live in this world of ambiguity where we have a CEO and maybe we have a lead independent director, but sometimes not, usually not. And there's this real, to your point, Brian, culture of who sets the tone at the board? And these are really difficult questions, and I don't think that there are always bright line answers. There was another really good point that was made somewhere in the chat about who's the right person to lead this discussion and sometimes deliver, to your point, Lori, the hard feedback. And somebody suggested that it should not be the company's regular outside counsel because maybe they're not all that independent and maybe they wouldn't really be well positioned to say that the emperor has no clothes, or and so maybe it is somebody who is truly independent. But if there was that person, would a board really want that person to give the real feedback? I question, and to many companies that I see out there.
And it requires an excellent communicator who has a lot of tact and emotional intelligence, etc. Okay, let's move on to another scenario. The evaluation reveals that several directors feel intimidated by one dominant voice in the boardroom. And interestingly enough, in the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission a couple of years ago on culture, this was a common theme. It's affecting debate, decision quality, and candor. However, no one wants to confront the behavior directly, and the director in question is high performing and materially valuable. Jessica, what's the right path forward on this one? How do you protect culture without losing a strong contributor? How often do you see cultural issues surfaced in an evaluation that required careful handling? And how did leadership handle it?
Well, I actually, when I looked at this scenario, I said there's kind of three issues. It's not just the one director. Part of it is, just the board culture. I mean, if you have that situation, there's something wrong with your board culture. And the one thing I know that is very helpful, and we've talked about it, was having that independent third party observe and do the 360 and give feedback to each director. Maybe they don't share that individual's feedback to everybody, but they give feedback, and making sure that you're starting to look at that as a change that you need to make to the culture of the board. I personally would talk to the person that's the dominant one, and I know people find that hard to do, but all of us at usually the board level have been executives for a while, or managers. You need to talk to people if they're not being effective, and even ask that person to challenge the others to talk more, to bring up and voice their opinion. So ask for that person's help in getting others to be engaged as they are. So play on their strength, but use it to get the other people engaged. There's also an issue with the people that aren't participating because they're afraid to participate. And, one of the things that I found as chair of a committee in this board and other boards, if you find people that aren't participating as much, you actually draw them out with questions, what's your perspective on this? So you do put them a little bit on the spot, but most of the time they find that very helpful in being more engaged in the conversation. So talking to your chairs and your chairperson. And then the last thing I say is don't wait for a formal evaluation. I mean, that's too late. When you have people that are disruptive, that no matter how good their output might be, just like any management situation, if they're not being effective and they're bringing the morale of the board down, you need to have a conversation with them. One of the things that I found at PG&E that's been really, really helpful has been at every meeting that we have a closed session that we can give feedback for the CEO, feedback for each other, feedback on how the meeting went. And Brian's team, I say, does an excellent job of even surveying us after every board so that we can give feedback to say, how did it go? And they actually take that feedback and take action items every board meeting. So this situation really needs a change, and it's a change in the board culture. And that third party, I'd bring them in, definitely.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to, again, all these issues are being discussed in the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission report that was 2 years ago. I think it's called Culture as a Strategic Asset, but I'm sure somebody will put it in the chat box for me, but it was terrific talking about all these issues. So thank you so much. And I agree. Why wait for once a year? If there's bad behavior, nip it in the bud in real time. Don't wait for a year till the next review process. Okay, third scenario. Directors rate themselves strongly across all categories, yet management feedback and external benchmarking ask whether the board really has the capabilities to oversee what's ahead, like AI and technology risk, geopolitical volatility, talent scarcity, stakeholder pressure. There's no framework for assessing future readiness, only you're talking about, hey, how did this guy or gal do over the last year? Logan, who should own a forward-looking evaluation? The Nom/Gov committee, the lead director, an external party? And how do you begin this conversation without creating defensiveness? And how do you really assess the future?
Yeah. So I disagree a little bit around there's no framework for assessing future, because I do think a board effectiveness inherently is a forward-looking document, whereas a board evaluation is that static or backward-looking component. So, thus some of the nuance on are you thinking about how effectively you're making decisions, or are you looking at the composition and the legal risks and the components that you've been discussing historically? So I do think there's a lot of discussion for many companies about board effectiveness looking forward, meaning, again, are those topics the right topics? Do you have the right committees in place? Do you have the right training and preparation for board directors, et cetera? In general, to the question of ownership, where I always would encourage the right third-party advisor to help depersonalize and make it objective. Companies can do this internally as well. I found that in general, if that process is owned by the Nom/Gov committee in whatever flavor it is, that it's probably the most effective, again, whether they're running it themselves or whether they're leveraging out, external help to get that done. But that in potential situations where they come up with conclusions or outcomes or things that need to be changed, it connects back to that conversation and Jessica's feedback. Usually it's the independent director or the chair that provides that feedback, but at times they may delegate it to the chair of the Nom/Gov committee because they're closer to it. And I think underlying it, your separate question about the creating the conversation without defensiveness, to me, it's that, do you have a culture where you're actually talking about things? And is this like the equivalent of the old hoary audit committee where everyone was on tenterhooks waiting to see what the violations would be? Or are you regularly talking about, hey, are we getting as much here as we want to? Are we spending as much time as we want to on this topic or that topic? And so is it an organic conversation, or is it a kind of periodic tense conversation? And I think, again, the more that boards can lean into it and recognize that these discussions are important and not just, kind of that they need to comply, the better chance you have of making it less defensive.
Thank you. And now everybody's favorite topic, AI, and I noticed there's some in the chat as well. So I'm gonna actually start with Louis, but I would love for any of you to share your ideas. If Louis, if AI, digital tools, and real-time data eventually make continuous evaluation possible, and Logan talked about perhaps on private company boards first, are boards really prepared for what that next level of visibility will reveal? And as I saw this, I thought of one extreme, the Ray Dalio Bridgewater, where people are being assessed in real time all the time in every meeting. What would change if directors could see patterns in how decisions get made over time and not just once in an annual review? And how do you feel about those AI and digital tools recording everything and perhaps giving feedback in the boardroom?
Well, let me start by answering the $64,000 question. I do not have a single board which is allowing it to be recorded or any kind of AI tools. And I intentionally scan for these things because most board meetings are now held over some sort of virtual platform, and I will kick them out of the room. And that's because I don't want the note taker taking notes and creating a discoverable record of who said what, when, where, how, why. But I do think that, in the future, I could foresee a world where, people are indeed coming up with processes to enable AI to tell us, these key things that are happening in the meeting. So, for example, what are the participation patterns over time? Which directors are dominating the discussion and getting too much airtime? Which executives are talking? Um, I could see AI telling us about decision-making dynamics, about how much time is actually spent making a decision. I think there could be influence and inclusion metrics. I think you could learn a lot about board culture. What would change? Would we get more change from individual directors? Would we get more leadership from the board or its chairs? Would we get more turnover and refreshment as the statistics, as cruel as they are, might force us to make decisions when they're staring at us in the face? And would we have more evaluation or less if we had AI? And certainly one thinks that there would be more, but certainly today we have none. So I'll stop there.
And I have so many more questions and so many excellent questions in the comment box, but we're coming up on time, unfortunately. So a lot of questions. As you both go around, I'm going to have you each give one key takeaway. But some things we haven't covered is, and that you can choose to talk about best practices for board continuing education. How do we evaluate board members who serve on multiple boards together? And how do you, I think we've talked about how do you have those difficult discussions. In terms of calling out underperformance, but there's still a lot of questions on those topics. So I'm going to let each of you go around and leave everyone with one key nugget, if you would. So Logan, why don't you start?
Again, hot seat. So I think, again, my refresher is, are your boards having the right conversations at the right time? And I would say my experience is decidedly different than Louis in terms of the prevalence of AI and other tools coming into the boardroom. There is as yet no clarity on what's required or what the best standard. So it's a little bit of it's a risky area. So I'm not trying to say that with any kind of dismissiveness, but I think that many companies that we work with, they're talking about effectiveness, are doing things like transcription of the proceedings and evaluations against that about effectiveness, who's talking, et cetera, without usually with name blind elements, et cetera. So we're seeing more focus on those areas, and so directors being comfortable with AI, being comfortable with new technologies is becoming part of the ante of what a good director would be. I don't think that hits, Lori, any of your questions about the specificity, but I mean, the reality is these things are coming, and it may not get to highly regulated, highly public companies for some time, but we're in an area now where folks are looking to experiment and looking to see what they can do with it because it's pervading daily life. So I think it's that bringing that mindset and then thinking about, are you having the right conversations at the right time, are both critical elements for success.
Thanks. Jessica?
I'll talk about the continuing education question. I think Brian and his team at PG&E do a great job of providing a list of continuing education that we have access to so that we know what's going on. We also are a member of NACD and a couple other groups so that we have access to that education. And what we just instituted, I think in the last year, is we track. We track what classes people are taking. And I've asked the chair to announce those in each meeting so that it encourages people that they take continuing education because it is an expectation. And I think that's how you keep your boards refreshed in a way, particularly like the AI topic is one that many of our board members have taken extra education on, and making it visible, not that they're taking it, but also visible the classes does help.
Thank you so much. Brian?
I guess my key takeaway would be to see the evaluation as an integrated process of board development. So it's a year-round effort. There's evaluation, follow-up, education, as Jessica said, and you think of that as skilling up. And Jessica, you might not know we don't just give the list. We might be gently suggesting to specific directors that they take certain classes. That
Wow,
quietly.
that is definitely a nugget. Okay, I like that.
Nomination, board succession, and refreshment, recruiting, those are all part of it, to make sure you have a smooth running board. And finally, shareholder engagement, which we didn't have a chance to get to, but getting feedback from institutional shareholders and feeding that back into this process is key.
Thanks. And Louis?
I would say the key takeaway here is that we are in a world of governance 4.0, and there now are a world of things that companies are doing. I think Brian and Jessica have really set the bar high for all of us to aspire to. Although for the rest of us, toiling on the ground, I would say, fear not that you're not doing all these things that Brian and Jessica are doing. And there are ways to attack them in morsels. And I sometimes feel like, being put in front of a challenge that's so large that it can never get done. And so rather than fail at trying to do everything, try and succeed in doing one small thing. And so if you're doing your annual evaluation, is really try and focus maybe on one or two areas where you're trying to drive improvement, and it could be key performance metrics if that's the topic. It could be refreshment, or what do we need for the future. You'll know what it is that your board needs, and I think that would be a productive way of meeting the challenge of 2026. Thank you so much, Lori, for the
Yeah,
chance to talk.
thrilled to have such great audience engagement. So many nuggets. I was taking notes, and you do set a very high bar, Jessica and Brian. This sounds like an extraordinary level of effectiveness and oversight. I totally agree with Louis. And thank you so much for the audience engagement. Lots going on in the chat, and happy holidays to everyone. And thank you so much, NACD Northern California.